Remember, psyche is soul. So there's 3 soul essentials in Jungian psychology. Individuation, which means to learn to integrate the conscious with the unconscious and take responsibility for yourself as an adult. So we're all on that journey, because if you don't succeed in that, then the world, the technology will rob you, right? If you don't learn to listen to your own unconscious and have a relationship with it, because the unconscious, as you know, is so much more vast than the conscious mind. It's a joke. Bruce Lipton says the unconscious mind has 1,000,000 times more processing power than the conscious mind. So that's the part of us that's connected to everything. I mean, everything. So then we have relationship. We can't do anything by ourselves. Somebody made the microphone we're talking into and the computer screens we're looking at each other on and the clothes we're wearing. And when, you know, you're going into relationship with all the students of the soul of filmmaking, and so then that powerful soul of yours infuses them, and then the third is created. So relationship, individuation, listen to your unconscious, have a relationship with it, become an adult and take responsibility for your choices. Relationships are what love is all about, and the soul is really a love bunny. And then competency, to develop the skills we need to live our dream. And so all that you were just talking about how you went from this to that, to poetry, to music, to filmmaking, and then this part of filmmaking, that's the foreplay that leads to the competency and builds the relationships and puts us in checkmate now and then, where we've got to sit still and say, okay, what is it that I'm really trying to say here? What is it that I really want to give to people? So really what you've been describing and that we've been talking about now is the process of us individuating, stepping into our dream, into our authentic expression of what moves us and that we want to help other people experience, know, and understand, which requires relationships. And so the flirtation of something's drawing me to this, something's drawing, that is this unconscious saying, look here, look here. It's what, you know, Arnold Mandel literally calls flirtation. It's the foreplay of love, and it is what Mark Goffney calls allurement. We're being allured into our greatest potential. And I think it's such a beautiful and important path, because the difference between going to a typical film school or going to any school is you're being told what to think, how to think, and what to do. But what you're inviting people to do is to really grow in their soul as a process of encapsulating and expressing the soul of a topic, or the soul of an event, or the soul of the circumstances of the world. And that there's the relationship factor. Right? And that, you know, when you go on the hero's journey, you have to meet the mentor, because you got to come to an ordeal that takes you beyond yourself. And so lo and behold, those that are ready to learn to really create stories and videos with soul meet their mentor, who's obviously very skilled, or I wouldn't be talking about this with you right now. As much as I love you, we would be talking about something that you do have mastery of, but you do have mastery of filmmaking. So what a great gift for people to know that the mentor is waiting for them. You know, I think that's so important, because there's a big difference between a mentor that's teaching you how to step into yourself and your authentic creativity, and another one saying, like, a good example is how many people come to my mandala workshops, or I do art therapy exercises in therapy, and they just absolutely are frightened to death to draw or paint anything. And 9 times out of 10, I say, you know, where did that fear come from? Because the child in you loves to paint, loves to draw, loves to create. And almost every time, well, when I was in art class, my teacher told me that I was shitty at making faces, or I was, you know, that I really wasn't cut out to be an artist. And it wounded the poor little soul. And my God, I had a guy one time, a 50-year-old man, cry for 4 hours in one of my workshops. And I had to sit down with him and really connect to him and pour some love into him to get him to put his first mark on the page, because he had so been chastised as a child because he liked to doodle and draw, but his parents criticized him for it all the time. And so what a great gift you're offering. And that brings me right to a big question. Generally speaking, the word myth is synonymous with story. James Carse, who is one of the most amazing people I've ever studied, whose books are, as you know, Finite and Infinite Games is a very powerful book. His book, was his other one that really blew my mind. It was a book on religion and belief. But anyhow, I won't go into that too much. Really, James Carse, who was an expert in theology, philosophy, and mythology, and I asked him in my podcast, what is a myth? And he said, Paul, a myth is a story that tells itself. And that one statement from him left me in a state of deep meditation. And I literally went and sat down with my soul and I said, if life is the story, then I need you to tell me who is telling it. And so, the reductio ad absurdum became God. But, for most, the definition of myth is so elusive, they don't grasp the profound mystery being conveyed. So my question for you, Ben, is how important is it to understand myth as a film producer, story writer? And what's the difference between a story and a story that tells itself? Because there's a lot of stories that you hear them, you read them, you can't even remember them. But there's, like there are certain stories that I will never forget because there is a mythological power in them that literally, like a successful meme, it keeps wanting to tell itself.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, for me, in that respect, there's lowercase s story. That's any story that you could tell, from the awful, from the senseless, all the way to the best ones, which I would say are mythology. The reason why I would say that, story and myth, like if there's a distinction between them, myth often encapsulates a culture and how a culture's consciousness seems to operate and what we find important. Like, all myth is impregnated with values, and they circle around values.
Yes.
And, a good myth is usually connected to culture, whereas an important and valuable, let's say, wives' tale or a story, such as The Boy Who Cried Wolf,
yes,
there's still value in them. It just doesn't seem to encapsulate a certain culture so much. I will say this about The Boy Who Cried Wolf. That doesn't have to have happened at all, right? There doesn't have needed to be a boy who actually got eaten by a wolf. And it's something that takes a valuable lesson. And most people probably, they haven't even studied that one enough to know what it's really saying. Unless you really sat down and looked at it. It's not talking about the danger of wolves. It's not talking about how little kids lie. It's talking about the consequence of lying to your group, to your tribe, to your family, to your community. The consequences of lying are you may get away with it once, twice, and you may get the benefit of that, laughing at all the people who were, who thought you were being eaten by a wolf. But eventually, if you tarnish your reputation as being a liar, somebody that people cannot trust at their word, then the consequence is when you need people the most, they will not be there for you. And so that's a story. And then when we balloon it out to myth, not only does that connect to a certain culture, but it lives on inside of us because it speaks to a substructure of our consciousness as a people so much that it has relevance for eons to come, as well as, and this is a thing with symbolism. Symbolism is the original language. It was a way of communicating without getting into the lingual centers of the brain. And there's a rich, vast wealth of wisdom that comes from symbolism. But most people need to be told directly what's going on to a certain extent. Like if you have in a film, somebody comes in, father walks in, slams the door, plops down on the couch, slams his fist on the table. You understand he's mad. You don't need him to scream out, "I'm mad."
No.
Right? That would be too on the nose. And the audience doesn't like being told in such an overt way. They want to discover along with you. Like I said, you plant the seeds, they have the original thought, so to speak. They think that this is their thought and it's original. The thing with mythology is it's multi-dimensional. It's myth nested within myth, or story nested within story.
Allegory.
Yeah. And so whereas you're watching a film and you're listening to the people talk, you have a sense for what's going on, but your eyes are also capturing there's a clock. And you may not see exactly what time it is, but your subconscious will.
Yes.
You may not realize that it's a pendulum clock that's not swinging,
Yeah.
but your subconscious will know it.
Yeah.
And then later on in the film, you hear the ticking of a pendulum clock. And your subconscious mind knows, okay, wait a minute, there was a pendulum clock that wasn't ticking, and that was when there was all these problems. Now all of a sudden there's a ticking clock, time is moving. They start to add interpretation on a subconscious level with the metaphor. And what you're doing to their consciousness is you're keeping a part of their consciousness entertained with the flashy stuff. Like, think of Fight Club. It was sexy, it was macho, it was masculine. But if you dig down beneath all the fighting and all the swearing and all the guys with their shirts off, what you're going to find is kind of almost like a Buddhist style philosophy underpinning the entire story. And so the reason why that's important is if you can engage several different dimensions of people's consciousness at once in a correlated way.
Yeah, so it's moving towards a realization.
They feel the richness. The audience understands there's richness here. I could watch it over and over again and still find more, and then still find more. That's because story is meant to model reality. If it's too superficial or one-dimensional, people are like, it's like telling a corny joke. I could see where it was going beforehand. It didn't do anything to me. You have to wow me. Show me that this sufficiently advanced technology of your story is like magic. I want it to wow me. I know you just told me a story. I know there's a science underpinning it, like David Blaine doing one of his tricks. I know there's a science to it. There's an explanation. But it was done so well, executed so well, that I'm just left in awe, and I love that feeling. I love that I couldn't figure out how you just did that, how your story just put me into that space by exceeding my expectations as well. So we have the ability and the power to do that. And mythology are examples of the past in how stories were told with such multidimensional meaning, getting really to the heart of what a culture and what a time period is about, that they live on for thousands of years. Like I said, we in the West still have Judeo-Christian myth shaping our reality and shaping a lot of our decision-making without us even knowing about it. That's the power of myth. And when we engage in the architecture and the fundamentals of storytelling, we start becoming the authors. We're almost like, cornering the market. We're getting more market share of how we can become the author of the new mythology. Because I will say that in this age of AI and rapidly advancing technologies and dumbfounded people, we are writing our new mythology right now.
Well, somebody is.
Somebody is, but we can.
Yeah.
We can engage with it, and therein lies the entire reason I made this the soul of filmmaking, is because I want to empower people to get involved in the myth of our time. Because if we don't write it, a small cohort will write.
Yeah.
You can guarantee that it will be laden with propaganda, meaning there's a hidden call to action that we will not benefit from.
No, absolutely.
Unless we begin authoring this new mythology.
We've had several hundred years of proof of that. And I think what makes myth so powerful is that we are inherently seeing ourselves in the story. Like if you read a story about how Jane does her laundry, there's not really any awakening there. But when you read the myth of Achilles, it makes you say, where's my Achilles heel? What's my it makes you start looking at yourself, right? Because even if this great warrior had an Achilles heel, and it took him down, the point is that a myth really is the greater self speaking to the self. It's the unconscious wholeness of the self speaking to the self that needs to wake up to itself. So the little SELF is being guided by the capital SELF, which is really individuation. It's self-realization. Just to loop back, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, you said many people don't really get the true message of the story. What rose up in me as the true message is intention drives manifestation. His intention was to trick people, but he manifested the reality of his intention. He got caught.
Yeah.
So I think, when we're creating story, it's so important, because as you know, I've made thousands and thousands of videos and hundreds of podcasts. So I always start with what's my intention. And once I know what my intention is, then the manifestation follows the flow. And as I teach my students in Spiritism, intention is extremely important, because if God is unconditional love, which a grand majority of world religious people agree, then by definition, God's unconditional until you have an intention. And once you have an intention, you polarize potential into spirit. It begins to flow. We put source potential into tension, and the unconditional goes from the infinite, becomes in the finite. We now embody it through intention. So I think if we think our intention is what puts spirit into flow, it takes pure potential, God's unconditional love, and says, let's make something together. And I think that's why, spending enough time in and with yourself and not being so externalized by all the bells and whistles around us, to find our heart and to get clear on what our intention is, because that's a very deep relationship that can only happen with your soul. That's not a head job. That's a heart job. If your head's leading your intention, then you're probably already somebody else's play toy.
Yeah.
But when your heart's leading your intention, you get a psychedelica, or you get the kind of documentaries that went viral, because it's insouled with the intention, if nothing else, to love and to inform and to share and to awaken. And I think those are so critical in our lives right now.